The United States currently carries a staggering $31.5 trillion in public debt held solely by the federal government, and this doesn't even encompass the roughly $3.2 trillion in state debt or the $17.1 trillion in household debt. Additionally, there's a substantial $24 trillion in corporate debt. It's essential to note that these figures represent only the USA, which is the world's largest and simultaneously one of the most indebted nations. Yet the United States comprises only a fraction of the total global debt, which has now soared past $300 trillion in US dollars. This colossal sum encompasses everything from the trillions in US government securities to the $500 someone might owe on their credit card. It's all money borrowed from various sources to fund diverse economic activities, whether that involves financing national infrastructure development or purchasing the latest gaming console. When we look at the average, the global debt figure is nearly 3 times the size of the global GDP. Each person alive today, on average, owes nearly $40,000, which is especially concerning when you consider that the average individual's per capita output is just over $10,000. Economists and commentators offer diverse perspectives on this situation, ranging from "it's nothing to be worried about" to "this will spell the end of the global economy as we know it." As is often the case, the truth likely lies somewhere between these two extremes. Many sensible economists express concern about current debt levels, but as long as certain conditions remain favorable, the situation should remain sustainable, although with some accompanying challenges. One key aspect for individuals is to grasp the dynamics of debt and how it functions differently at individual, national, and global levels. So, who exactly are we indebted to? Can a debt load that's 3 times the size of the global GDP ever be sustainable? Is there a responsible approach to reducing this debt? And what could go wrong if we fail to do so? Global debt behaves in a rather distinct manner compared to debt at the individual level, where an individual takes out a loan from a lending entity and repays it over time. On a global scale, there isn't an external entity loaning money to the entire world. Economists sometimes humorously remark that we haven't yet received Martian approval for our loan applications. The unique nature of global debt can make it somewhat challenging to fully comprehend. Therefore, be prepared for some complexity, but by sticking with us, you'll likely come away with a more comprehensive understanding of global debt than most people who read headlines about our current situation. Debt seems straightforward when it's one entity owing money to another entity that initially provided the funds. However, in the global economy, it's essentially indebted to itself. Every liability held by a government, company, bank, or individual corresponds to an asset for another government, company, bank, or individual. When the global economy takes on debt, it's not so much borrowing from an external entity as it is borrowing money from its own future self. If we were to simplify global debt and view it as one single loan with an outstanding balance of $300 trillion in US dollars, increasing this balance would entail spending more than we pay back on that loan. On an individual level, such behavior might be considered irresponsible. But remember, on a global scale, for every dollar added to this debt, an equal dollar is added to an asset on the opposite side of the balance sheet. Taking on more debt can be highly beneficial if it's directed toward investments in projects that generate more value for the global economy in the long term. Economists typically assess debt on an economy-wide scale in relation to GDP, known as the debt-to-GDP ratio. While this ratio is a valuable measure for economists, it can also be somewhat misleading and sound more alarming than it truly is. The total global debt now stands at 3 times the total global GDP, but it's essential to recognize that debt accumulates while GDP is measured discretely year by year. If an individual carried a debt that was 3 times their annual income, it wouldn't necessarily be a significant cause for concern, particularly if that debt was invested in assets like student loans or a mortgage, which would enhance their long-term financial well-being. A more relevant metric might be to compare global debt to global assets, essentially creating a global net worth concept. This not only offers a more reassuring perspective on the global debt situation, but also allows us to present a figure we've never featured on this channel before. Total global assets, encompassing everything from real estate and vehicles to stocks, cryptocurrencies, and even the bonds and loans making up global debt, amounted to approximately $1 quadrillion in 2021. Consequently, after deducting this record global debt, the planet's net worth stands at around $700 trillion. This demonstrates that, on the whole, we are in a better financial position than ever before. However, economists don't frequently employ this figure. For one, determining asset values accurately is quite challenging. The value of a family heirloom may differ significantly from one person to another, making it problematic to establish values for all these assets on a global scale. Therefore, the $1 quadrillion figure likely excludes numerous smaller and less liquid assets as well. Beyond the complexities of working with asset values, economists primarily rely on GDP figures to gather most of the information they need, even though it can sometimes mislead the average person about the global economic situation. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product and essentially represents the total economic output of a country. In theory, this could be calculated by summing the total value of every good and service produced for the market within that economy each year. However, this method is exceedingly challenging since it would entail placing an economy at the end of every single production line, in every restaurant, and within the offices of builders throughout the entire economy, an impractical task. Instead, economists examine spending because if something is produced for the market, it will eventually be purchased in some form. This is somewhat analogous to a photographer working with negative images. The data they capture is the exact opposite of what they need, yet they can still utilize it to construct a detailed picture of what's happening. GDP can be equated to total output, which in turn is equivalent to total market demand. Market demand is further subdivided into categories such as consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Since we are evaluating the entire global economy, we can exclude net exports because, for the moment, we aren't engaging in trade with extraterrestrial beings, so net exports are essentially zero. Absolutely nothing is departing from or arriving on Earth, making net exports zero in our current context. As a quick side note, when a business produces something for the economy that isn't purchased by consumers, it falls into one of two categories. If the product is placed in storage to be sold at a later date, it's considered an investment, as it's essentially an investment into inventory. Alternatively, if the business discards the product, it's still counted as consumption. Macroeconomists compiling GDP figures don't distinguish between whether the product is consumed by a person or discarded. Now, increasing debt will, all else being equal, boost economic output because it injects more purchasing power into these three main categories: consumption, investment, and government spending. When governments take on debt, it's typically to finance welfare or infrastructure projects without increasing taxes. Households, on the other hand, utilize debt to consume goods and services or to make investments, such as purchasing housing. Businesses, in their borrowing, acquire machinery or, in recent times, use it to repurchase their own shares, which in either case constitutes a form of investment. Global debt is attributed to three primary groups: governments, businesses, and households. Some economists also include a distinct category for financial corporations because they take on debt to generate more debt elsewhere, rather than for personal consumption or investments. Regardless of the purpose of the debt, it initially bolsters one or more of the factors that comprise GDP. However, once borrowed, it must ultimately be repaid, which means households, businesses, and even governments will need to curtail their spending to meet their repayment obligations. On an individual level, the process of taking on debt and paying it back often involves significant peaks and extended valleys. However, the global economy comprises 8 billion people, millions of businesses, and hundreds of governments, which leads to the law of large numbers mitigating this trend, though it doesn't completely eliminate it. The cycle of people globally taking on debt to stimulate the economy, followed by a period of debt repayment, isn't entirely random. When discussing global debt levels, economists refer to this as the debt cycle. This cycle explains why, even in the absence of external shocks, the economy undergoes natural periods of growth and recession roughly every decade. The role of governments within this cycle is to take measures that are somewhat contrary to the actions of consumers and businesses. When consumers and businesses are taking on substantial debt to stimulate consumption and investment, governments should consider increasing taxes and reducing spending to accumulate more funds and temper expenditure to avoid an overly exuberant economic environment. When individuals and businesses are primarily focused on repaying their debts, governments should adopt a counter-cyclical fiscal policy by reducing taxes and increasing spending to prevent a complete economic standstill. Governments have generally been adept at stimulating the economy during downturns in the debt cycle or due to external shocks. We witnessed this firsthand following the global financial crisis, GFC, and more recently during the pandemic. However, governments tend to struggle with the less popular task of increasing taxes and reducing spending during prosperous times. As a result, in recent decades, governments worldwide have consistently accumulated more debt, sometimes matching or even surpassing the rates at which businesses and individuals do. Nonetheless, this isn't inherently negative if the debt is used to enhance a country's productive capacity, generating more value than the repayments it entails. The most straightforward approach for governments to achieve this is by investing in infrastructure and education to boost their nation's overall productivity. While some government spending is naturally dedicated to projects with purely humanitarian objectives, the majority are not. Projects like railways and public roads are constructed for the benefit of the public, and they often don't generate a traditional profit since they typically don't directly charge people for using these pieces of infrastructure. However, in almost every advanced economy, economists are engaged to conduct benefit studies on major projects before they are undertaken, ensuring that these projects will yield more economic value over their expected lifetimes than they cost. However, if governments continuously accumulate debt to finance projects that fail to generate a positive economic return, they could face financial difficulties. Political factors sometimes hinder optimal spending, leading to misallocation of resources. This is where government debt can become problematic. A significant portion of the stimulus spending carried out by numerous governments during the pandemic may not have a substantial long-term positive impact on the economy's output. It's essential to note that these policies, like the stimulus measures during the pandemic, were not necessarily mistakes. They were vital responses to desperate times, focused on preventing an immediate economic collapse rather than setting up the economy for long-term growth. For households and businesses, the composition of GDP holds even more significance as they contribute to consumption and investment. An economy can produce items like a plate of pasta for immediate consumption or a pot that will be used to make more pasta. Both items possess value, but the pot retains its value and becomes part of the approximately $1 quadrillion worth of global assets. In contrast, the pasta, once consumed, no longer has any value. Debt incurred to acquire assets is generally considered good debt, whereas debt taken on for consumption is often labeled bad debt because there's no means for the pasta to generate future economic value to repay the debt used for consumption. This is the simplified breakdown, and a significant portion of the world's debt is directed toward investment purchases. Consequently, the items being produced now will contribute to the growth of the $1 quadrillion pool of assets comprising the global economy, ultimately making us wealthier overall. Assuming all other factors remain constant, the global economy would benefit from having $1 quadrillion worth of capital and $300 billion worth of debt, rather than just having $700 billion worth of capital. This surplus capital could be invested in creating better jobs, fostering new industries, advancing technology, and driving economic growth in the long run. However, The key lies in ensuring that these investments are directed toward assets that genuinely enhance economic output. Global net worth has surged by approximately 50% over the past 50 years, with a 25% increase in just the last 2 decades. During this same period, GDP has grown by more than tenfold compared to its 1970 levels. While this might initially seem positive, it implies that the investments made in the $1 quadrillion worth of assets are now 50% less productive than they were half a century ago. This trend is especially noticeable in advanced economies, where wealth has outpaced output by a significant margin. As a result, debt levels are rising, but the genuine value of the economy is increasing much faster, at least on paper. However, the actual value of these assets hinges on the dynamics of supply and demand, and it ultimately comes down to how much someone is willing to pay for them. Today's debt load is indeed high relative to economic output, but it is lower than past levels concerning the total wealth of the planet. This is a positive situation as long as this wealth is actively contributing to increasing output and creating opportunities for the global economy. Unfortunately, many of the assets that have seen the most appreciation in recent decades have been non-productive assets, primarily real estate. The total value of global real estate is approximately $350 trillion, with about $250 trillion of that, 2.5 times global GDP, comprising land, while the remaining $100 trillion is represented by the physical buildings situated on that land. Many rapidly developing countries worldwide are grappling with significant debt issues because their economic growth has stagnated, making it challenging and expensive to secure financing. The flow of debt towards assets like real estate in advanced economies is considered safer compared to directing it towards factories in developing economies, even if the factories have the potential to contribute more to the global economy than a mere pile of land. At the global level, it would be far more advantageous if debt weren't utilized to drive speculation on unproductive assets. Nevertheless, the debt itself isn't the issue. However, when we zoom into the national level, it becomes crucial to inquire about the entities to which we owe all this money. About 95% of the world's wealth, including the $300 billion in debts, is held by households, with governments and businesses accounting for the remaining 5%. It's worth noting that businesses, even though they generate value in the economy, also possess assets, yet these enterprises are ultimately owned by individuals, either directly through ownership of company shares or indirectly via various retirement savings plans. The 5% of global net worth overseen by governments consists of foreign currency reserves, publicly owned real estate, state-owned enterprises, sovereign wealth funds, and in rare cases, direct government loans. Many governments, including the U.S. federal government, have a negative net worth. China boasts the largest share of global government wealth, primarily in the form of foreign currency reserves and land holdings. In some exceptional instances, governments themselves issue loans directly to other countries, although the success of such endeavors varies. While it may sound reassuring to claim that on a global scale, we are essentially indebted to ourselves, this assertion doesn't hold true on any other scale. The average net worth of an individual on Earth stands at approximately $90,000, but this average is skewed by a select few extremely affluent individuals. This could potentially pose a significant challenge, but we'll be delving into this topic in depth in our upcoming video next week. To ensure you don't miss it, please subscribe to our channel. If you prefer to listen to our content, you can find all our videos and complete interviews with top economists on our Spotify page. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.